In 2017, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy. It owed approximately $5 billion in debt. That debt did not come from bad products, from falling demand, or even from Amazon. It came from a deal signed 17 years earlier that the company never recovered from, a deal the people who signed it called a triumph. By the time most people noticed something was wrong, it was already over. 800 stores, 33,000 employees, gone. This is not a story about disruption. This is a story about a company that was handed a loaded gun and told it was a gift. To understand how Toys R Us died, you have to understand what it was. Founded in 1948 by Charles Lazarus in Washington, D.C., it started as a baby furniture store. Lazarus noticed something. Parents who bought cribs eventually needed toys. He pivoted. That pivot would make him a billionaire. By the 1970s, Toys R Us had industrialized the toy shopping experience. Giant warehouse-style stores, deep inventory, prices that crushed smaller competitors. It was the category killer before anyone used that phrase. Children dragged their parents through those aisles like it was a religious pilgrimage. At its peak in the late 1990s, Toys R Us operated over 1,500 stores globally and generated revenues of approximately $11 billion annually. It controlled an estimated 17 to 20% of the entire United States toy market. For context, that is a dominant position most retailers spend decades trying to reach and never do. Then came the internet. And here is where the story takes its first wrong turn, not the fatal one, but the first one. In 1999, Toys R Us launched its e-commerce website. The holiday season arrived. Orders poured in. The company could not fulfill them. Thousands of children received nothing on Christmas morning. The Federal Trade Commission fined Toys R Us $350,000 for failing to deliver orders on time. The reputational damage was considerably more expensive than that, but the company had a plan. They would solve the logistics problem by outsourcing it entirely. They would partner with a small but growing online retailer. That retailer was Amazon. In 2000, Toys R Us signed a deal with Amazon to become the exclusive toy seller on Amazon's platform. Toys R Us would handle the inventory. Amazon would handle the website and fulfillment. It sounded reasonable. It was not reasonable. It was catastrophic. And nobody in the room apparently thought to read the fine print about the word exclusive. Amazon, quietly and without particular fanfare, began allowing third-party toy sellers onto its platform almost immediately. Toys R Us was sharing its supposedly exclusive marketplace with direct competitors. When Toys R Us discovered this, it sued Amazon. In 2006, a New Jersey court sided with Toys R Us and voided the contract. They were free, and now 5 years behind on building their own digital infrastructure. That lost half-decade mattered enormously. Between 2000 and 2005, e-commerce in the United States grew from roughly $27 billion to over $87 billion. Toys R Us spent those years legally entangled with its own digital distribution partner instead of building a competing capability. By the time they were free to act, the window for easy dominance had already closed. But the Amazon mistake, damaging as it was not the kill shot. The kill shot came in 2005. That year, a consortium of private equity firms, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, Vornado Realty Trust, and Bain Capital, purchased Toys R Us in a leveraged buyout for approximately $6.6 billion. A leveraged buyout, for the uninitiated, means the buyers use the company's own assets and future earnings to finance the purchase. The company essentially buys itself, and then owes the bill. The deal loaded Toys R Us with approximately $5 billion in long-term debt. Annual interest payments alone were reportedly around $400 million. To be precise about what that means, every single year, before Toys R Us spent $1 on store renovations, technology, marketing, or competing with anyone, it owed $400 million just to service the cost of having been purchased. The board approved it. Of course they did. For context, Walmart spent aggressively on e-commerce throughout this period. Target invested in store experience and digital infrastructure. Amazon, obviously, was Amazon. Toys R Us, meanwhile, was allocating the majority of its available capital to interest payments on debt incurred not to grow the company, but to transfer its ownership. Every dollar paid to creditors was a dollar not spent on survival. The private equity firms had a plan, as private equity firms always do. They intended to take Toys R Us public again, recouping their investment through an IPO. They filed for an IPO in 2010, then again in 2013. The market was never quite right, the timing never quite perfect. The IPO never happened. The debt remained. The clock kept running. Meanwhile, the stores were deteriorating. Underfunded and understaffed, Toys R Us locations became visibly tired compared to competitors. Customer surveys from the era noted that shopping there felt dated. The app was clunky. The website, the one they'd finally built after the Amazon disaster, lagged years behind industry standards. You cannot renovate a store when your renovation budget is being consumed by interest payments on a deal that happened a decade ago. By 2017, Toys R Us was generating roughly $11 billion in annual revenue, nearly the same top-line number as its late 1990s peak. That is the darkest kind of irony. The revenue was still there. Customers were still there, arguably, but the margin had been consumed by debt, the stores had been neglected into irrelevance, and the online experience had been allowed to atrophy for the better part of 2 decades. In September 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection with approximately $5 billion in liabilities. The company initially framed this as a restructuring, not a closure. Management said the brand was strong. The fundamentals were sound. They just needed to reorganize the debt. Analysts were skeptical. The analysts were correct. Attempts to find a buyer or restructuring partner failed. In March 2018, the company announced it would close or sell all of its roughly 800 remaining United States stores. In June 2018, the last American Toys R Us locations shut their doors. 33,000 workers lost their jobs. Many received no severance. The private equity owners, for their part, had collected hundreds of millions in fees over the years of ownership. That is not an editorial judgment. That is a documented accounting fact. The cultural weight of the collapse was considerable. A Reuters/Ipsos poll taken around the time of closure found that Toys R Us ranked among the most recognized retail brands in America. Brand recognition was not the problem. Brand recognition had never been the problem. You can have every American know your name and still be buried under $5 billion in debt with no path out. A small number of Toys R Us stores reopened in 2019 under new ownership. By 2021, a licensing deal with Macy's brought the brand into select department store locations. The ghost of the brand walks retail floors to this day, a name tag on someone else's shelf space. It is a peculiar kind of afterlife for something that was once an empire. Here is the lesson. Private equity leveraged buyouts are not inherently wrong, but they are structurally indifferent to the long-term survival of the company being purchased. When a business that needs to invest aggressively to compete in technology, in experience, in digital, is instead required to service hundreds of millions in annual debt, it will lose. Not because it was weak, because it was mathematically forbidden from winning. The people who structured that deal knew the math. They made it anyway. If you want to understand how an $11 billion retailer collapses without anyone being surprised, study the Toys R Us deal. Study who got paid when they got paid and who was left holding the consequences. The answers are illuminating and not particularly flattering to anyone involved. Next time, the company that invented the digital camera watched the world go digital and still found a way to lose everything. Subscribe for more hidden empires.